They fined me $100 a day over 3 weeks. So I turned my front yard into something they could never control again. And by the time they realized what I'd done, it was already too late. It started on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, the kind where the coffee's still too hot and the sun hits your porch just right. And I remember stepping outside barefoot, half awake, thinking about nothing more than whether I had time to mow later that week. And that's when I saw it. Bright yellow paper taped right across my front door like some kind of warning label, bold black letters screaming at me before I even peeled it off. Violation notice. Property not in compliance. Daily fine, $100 until resolved. I just stood there for a second, squinting at it like maybe I was still dreaming, like maybe it belonged to someone else and got stuck on my door by mistake. But no, my name was printed right there, nice and official, like they'd been waiting for this moment. I remember looking out at my yard, actually turning in a full slow circle like I was missing something obvious, and all I saw was normal. Grass was cut the weekend before, mailbox standing straight. A couple of those stubborn little dandelions near the curb, sure, but nothing you'd call a problem unless you were actively looking for one. And that was the thing about our neighborhood, someone was always looking. We lived in a place called Alder Ridge Estates, just outside a mid-sized town in Oregon. One of those cookie-cutter developments where every house looked like it came out of the same catalog, and every lawn was supposed to look like it had been vacuumed instead of grown. And at the center of all that perfection was the HOA. More specifically, the woman who ran it like her own private kingdom, Marianne Keller. Now Marianne wasn't just strict, she was the kind of person who smiled when she corrected you, like she was doing you a favor by pointing out everything you'd done wrong. I'd seen her walk around the neighborhood with a clipboard more times than I could count, stopping at driveways, peering at hedges, measuring things that didn't need measuring, and I'd always kept my head down, figured if I didn't give her a reason, she'd move on to someone else. Apparently, 3 dandelions were reason enough. I crumpled the notice a little in my hand, not enough to destroy it, just enough to release some of that pressure building in my chest, and went back inside, pacing around my kitchen like I was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. $100 a day. That wasn't a warning, that was a threat. And the more I thought about it, the more it stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling personal. I mean, there were yards on my street with patchy grass, faded fences, even one guy who left his trash cans out all week. But somehow I was the one getting hit with fines over flowers that literally grew themselves. So I did what you're supposed to do in those situations. I decided to go talk to them, clear it up like a reasonable adult. The HOA board met every second Thursday at the community clubhouse, this beige little building that smelled faintly like old carpet and cheap coffee. And that evening I walked in with the violation notice folded neatly in my pocket, telling myself to stay calm, stay polite, just explain the situation and it would all get sorted out. There were about 6 people sitting around a long table, most of them retirees who looked like they'd been part of this board longer than anyone could remember. And then there was Marianne at the head, posture straight, hands folded like she was presiding over a courtroom instead of a neighborhood meeting. When she saw me walk in, she gave that same tight smile I'd seen 100 times before, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. "Mr. Lawson," she said, like she'd been expecting me, like this was all part of some script she'd already written. I nodded, took a seat, waited for them to finish whatever they were discussing before I spoke up, and when I did, I kept my voice even, controlled. I explained that I maintained my yard regularly, that the notice seemed excessive, that I was more than willing to remove the weeds if that was the issue. I even joked a little, said something like, "If we're declaring war on dandelions now, I guess I'm already losing." A couple of the board members chuckled under their breath, but Marian didn't. She just leaned back in her chair, tilting her head slightly as if she were studying me, and then she said it. "Rules are rules, Mr. Lawson. Compliance isn't optional." There was a pause after that, the kind that stretches just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable, and I could feel the room shift, like people suddenly didn't want to be part of the conversation anymore. I tried again, a little firmer this time, pointing out that the fine was extreme, that most communities would issue a warning first, but she cut me off before I could finish. "Perhaps," she said, that same smile creeping back, "if maintaining your property is difficult, you might consider hiring a professional." It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. Like I was incompetent, like I was the problem. And something about that Something about being talked down to over something so small, it lit a fuse I didn't even realize was there. I remember sitting there, hands clasped together, nodding like I understood, like I accepted it, but inside, something had already shifted. Because if they were going to treat 3 weeds like a violation, then maybe it was time I showed them what a real one looked like. I didn't storm out of that meeting, didn't slam a chair or raise my voice. I just nodded, thanked them for their time like everything was perfectly reasonable, and walked back to my car with that folded notice still in my pocket. But the second I closed the door and sat there in the quiet, that's when it hit me. Not anger exactly. Not right away. More like clarity. Because the thing about people like Marianne Keller is they don't actually care about grass or weeds or whether your yard looks like a magazine cover. What they care about is control, the kind you don't notice until you push back, and suddenly every rule becomes a weapon. And I realized, sitting there in that dim parking lot with the clubhouse lights buzzing behind me, that if I played this straight, I'd lose. I'd pull the weeds, they'd find something else. Fix that, they'd move the goalposts again. It wasn't about 3 dandelions, it was about making sure I stayed in line. So instead of asking how to comply, I started asking how far I could go without breaking the law. That weekend, I didn't mow the lawn. I tore it out. And I don't mean a little patch here and there. I mean I went full-on demolition mode. Rented a sod cutter early Saturday morning, the kind that growls when you start it up like it's warning you not to back out. And I spent hours peeling away that perfect, HOA-approved grass in long, heavy strips, rolling it up like carpet and stacking it along the driveway, while a couple of my neighbors slowed down as they drove past, probably wondering what the hell I was doing. Old Mr. Donnelly from across the street actually walked over at one point, hands in his pockets, squinting at the mess like he was trying to solve it. "You redoing the yard, Caleb?" he asked, casual but curious. I wiped sweat off my forehead, looked out at the bare dirt, and said, "Yeah, something like that." He nodded slowly, like he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press. Most people in Alder Ridge didn't press. That's how the HOA liked it. By Sunday afternoon, the lawn was gone. Just gone. No uniform green, no clean edges, just raw earth, uneven and a little wild-looking already. And standing there, looking at it, I remember thinking how strange it felt, like I'd just erased something I'd never really wanted in the first place. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, digging into everything I could find about property regulations, HOA bylaws, state protections, all the stuff no one bothers reading until they have to. And that's when I stumbled across it, a state program for certified wildlife habitats. At first, it sounded like one of those niche things you'd see in a pamphlet at a nature center. Plant native species, provide water sources, create shelter for local wildlife. But the more I read, the more it clicked. Because once a property was registered and approved, it wasn't just landscaping anymore. It was protected. Not by the HOA, by the state. And HOAs, they don't like going up against the state. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, and for the first time since that yellow notice showed up, I smiled. Because now this wasn't just about getting even, it was about changing the game entirely. The next few weeks turned into something that, looking back, felt almost obsessive, but in the best way. Every evening after work, every free hour on the weekends, I was out there turning that empty dirt lot into something completely different. I started with wildflowers, not the neat little rows you see in garden centers, but a mix of native species, bright reds, deep purples, yellows that practically glowed in the afternoon sun. I scattered seeds in a way that felt random but intentional, letting nature decide the pattern instead of forcing it into lines. Then came the taller plants, sunflowers that would eventually tower over the fence line, swaying slightly even when there wasn't much wind, like they had a life of their own. Along the edges, I planted clover, thick and soft, the kind that spreads low and stubborn, filling in gaps the way grass never quite could. And then the bamboo. That one took some thought, because bamboo grows fast, and once it takes hold, it doesn't ask permission. I lined it along one side of the yard, creating a kind of natural barrier that would, over time, block the clean, open sight lines the HOA loved so much. It wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It was controlled, deliberate, just not by their standards. As the weeks passed, things started to change in ways I hadn't fully expected. At first, it was small, a few bees drifting through the flowers, then more, then butterflies, actual clusters of them, fluttering between blooms like they'd been waiting for this place to exist. One morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and heard birds, not just the occasional chirp, but full-on activity, movement in the bamboo, nests starting to form. It was alive in a way that no trimmed lawn ever is. And people noticed. You could see it in the way cars slowed down just a little as they passed, in the way neighbors who'd never said more than a quick hello suddenly lingered on the sidewalk, pointing things out. A woman named Teresa, who lived a few houses down, brought her 2 kids over one afternoon, both of them wide-eyed, running straight toward the flowers like they'd just found a hidden park. "Is this allowed?" she asked me quietly, almost like she didn't want to say it too loud. I shrugged, took a sip of my coffee, and said, "As far as I know." She smiled at that, but there was something else there too. Curiosity, maybe even a little hope. Soon, more people started coming by. Kids mostly, but not just them. Someone started calling it the Butterfly Yard, and the name stuck, spreading through the neighborhood faster than any HOA notice ever could. And here's the part one didn't see coming: the realtors. One Saturday, I noticed a couple walking past with a man in a blazer, the kind of guy who talks with his hands a lot, and he actually gestured toward my yard while he was showing them a house down the street. I couldn't hear everything he said, but I caught enough. Eco-friendly landscaping, increasing buyer interest, unique feature in the neighborhood. I almost laughed right there on my porch. The same yard that had gotten me fined was now being used as a selling point. It didn't take long for Marianne to notice. Of course it didn't. About a month after I started, just as everything was really coming together, another envelope showed up. Not taped this time, just slipped neatly into my mailbox like they were trying to keep things civil. I opened it standing right there at the curb, already knowing what it would say before I even read it. Second notice of violation. Property not in compliance with community standards. Immediate action required. I looked up from the paper at my yard, at the flowers swaying, the bees moving lazily from bloom to bloom, the bamboo starting to rise, and for a moment, I just stood there, letting the contrast sink in. Because to them, this was a problem. But to everyone else, it had become something else entirely. And that's when I realized they weren't just going to let this go. They weren't going to let it go. And honestly, by that point, I didn't want them to. Because something had shifted, not just in my yard, but in how I saw the whole situation. Like what started as a reaction had quietly turned into something bigger, something I actually cared about. So when that second notice showed up, I didn't rush to respond, didn't panic, didn't start pulling anything out. I just folded it once, set it on the kitchen counter, and went back outside with my coffee like it wasn't even there. And over the next few days, I noticed something interesting. People were watching. Not in a nosy, judgmental way like before, but in that quiet, waiting kind of way, like they were curious how this was going to play out, like maybe what I did next mattered more than just my yard. A couple neighbors stopped by, asked if everything was okay, if the HOA was giving me trouble, and I could hear it in their voices. They'd all had their own run-ins, small ones, the kind you brush off, but they added up. Teresa came by again, this time without the kids, leaned against the fence and said, "They sent me a letter last year because my mailbox post was the wrong shade of brown." She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't really funny. That's the thing about control. It spreads quietly until everyone's adjusting their lives around it without even realizing. So I told her, "Yeah, they're pushing again," and she nodded like she expected that, then looked out at the yard, the flowers, the movement, and said, "I hope you win." I didn't answer right away, just watched a butterfly land on one of the taller blooms, wings opening and closing slowly, and finally said, "Me too." But the truth was, I wasn't planning to win the way they thought. Because a few weeks before any of this even started, back when I was just reading through all those regulations late at night, I'd already submitted the application. I'd documented everything: plant types, layout, water sources, shelter areas. Even added a small bird bath tucked near the bamboo, something simple but enough to meet the requirements. I'd taken photos at different stages, filled out forms most people wouldn't have the patience for, and sent it all off to the state conservation program with a kind of quiet determination I hadn't felt in a long time. And then I waited. So when the HOA escalated, when they sent a formal demand threatening additional penalties, even hinted at legal action, I still didn't respond right away. I let them build momentum, let them believe they were in control, because timing was everything. The approval came on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the email notification popping up while I was at work, subject line simple, almost boring. Habitat certification approved. I opened it expecting some kind of official language, but the part that mattered was clear enough. My property was now recognized as a certified wildlife habitat under state guidelines, and any actions taken to remove or damage that habitat without proper review could result in legal consequences. I sat there staring at the screen for a minute, reading it again just to be sure, and then I leaned back in my chair and let out this slow breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. Because that was it. That was the line they couldn't cross. I printed the letter that evening, along with the official certification, and the next morning, I walked it over to the HOA office myself. Marianne was there. Of course she was, sitting behind that same desk, everything in its place like always. She looked up when I walked in, gave that familiar, practiced smile, but this time, it didn't quite land the same. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "I was hoping we'd hear from you." I stepped forward, set the papers on her desk, and said, calm as ever, "You have." She glanced down, skimmed the first page, and I watched it happen. That subtle shift, the way her expression tightened just slightly, the smile fading at the edges. She flipped to the next page, then the next, reading more carefully now, and the room felt different, quieter somehow, like even the air was waiting. "This doesn't exempt you from community standards," she said finally, but there was less certainty in her voice than before. I shook my head just a little. "Actually," I said, "it does at least when those standards conflict with state environmental protections." There was a pause, longer this time. One of the other board members, a guy named Richard who rarely spoke, leaned over to look at the documents, adjusting his glasses as he read, and then he muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like, "We might want to be careful here." Marianne straightened in her chair, trying to regain that sense of control, but it was slipping. I could see it. "We'll need to review this," she said. I nodded. "Of course," I replied, already turning toward the door. "You should." And that was it. No raised voices, no dramatic exit, just a quiet handoff. A few days later, the letter came. Not from the HOA, from the State Environmental Agency. It was addressed directly to the board, but somehow a copy made its way to me, probably not by accident. The wording was formal, but the message was clear. Any attempt to enforce penalties or require alterations to a certified habitat without proper legal grounds could result in action against the association. That was the end of it. No more notices. No more fines. No follow-up meetings. Just silence. And over time, that silence turned into something else. The yard kept growing, filling in, changing with the seasons, becoming less of a project and more of a presence. The bamboo thickened along the edge, the flowers came back in waves, different colors at different times, and the wildlife, it stayed. Birds nested year after year, butterflies returned like they had a map. Even the neighbors started to shift in small ways. A couple houses down, someone replaced part of their lawn with native plants, not as wild as mine, but enough to notice. Teresa added a little pollinator garden by her porch. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. And Marianne? I still see her sometimes, walking the neighborhood with that same clipboard, but she doesn't stop in front of my house anymore. She glances, just for a second, then keeps moving, like she knows some battles aren't worth picking. Every now and then, someone new moves into the neighborhood and asks about the yard, how it happened, why it's different, and I usually just smile and say, long story. Because it is, and it isn't. It started with 3 weeds, but it ended with something they couldn't control, something that didn't fit into neat lines or uniform standards. And the best part? I haven't mowed a single blade of grass since. Now here's the thing. Some people say what I did was petty, that I escalated something small into something bigger than it needed to be. Others say it was justified, that sometimes the only way to deal with control is to challenge it head on. So I'm curious, what do you think? Was this standing up for what's right, or just revenge dressed up as principle? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've seen both sides, and honestly, I'm still not sure where the line really is.